order.
This traffic stop in Waller County sparked protests 4 years ago.
Get out of the car!
And for the first time,
Get out of the car!
we're seeing Sandra Bland's arrest from her perspective inside the car. The video was obtained by the nonprofit Investigative Network.
For a failure to signal. You're doing all of this for a failure to signal.
Get over that car.
No, you don't have the right.
Step out of the car.
You do not have the right to do that.
I do have the right. Now step out or I will remove you. I'm going to drag you out of here.
So you threatening to drag me out of my own car?
Get out of the car!
And then
I will light you up. Get out!
Wow.
Fair.
Bland died 3 days later in the Waller County jail. Her death ruled a suicide. But Bland's family says her cell phone video changes everything.
I have a right to record this.
They claim it was withheld by investigators. Now state representatives are asking why.
Typically, all evidence that's deemed relevant comes out at the time, so we'll have to look further into why this was withheld.
But those involved in the investigation say this is not new evidence. DPS sent a statement saying the video recording from Miss Bland's cell phone was specifically identified multiple times in the Ranger report of investigation. The Ranger report was made available to all the litigants during the civil litigation filed by her family.
Her property, including this phone, was given back to the family years ago.
Chip Lewis is former Trooper Brian Encinia's lawyer. He was indicted for perjury, but the charge was dropped in exchange for Encinia never working in law enforcement again.
The tragedy that was this young lady's death should have never happened. It was not Trooper Encinia's fault that it happened.
As for reopening the case, that decision lies with the Waller County DA. Elton Mathis tells us the investigation was handled diligently and, quote, I have no knowledge at this time of new evidence to second-guess the work of those 5 special prosecutors or the grand jury.
That was activist Sandra Bland getting arrested after a routine traffic stop escalated back on July 10, 2015. 3 days later, she was found dead in her jail cell. 3 years later, the mysteries that still surround her death are examined in the new HBO documentary, Say Her Name, The Life and Death of Sandra Bland. Her 2 sisters, Shantae Needham and Sharon Cooper, join us now. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
So, Sharon, your sister Sandra's death 3 years ago sparked public outrage, mass protests in the country. Can you just remind everyone exactly what happened to her?
Exactly. Thank you all for having us here. We really appreciate it. Sandra was actually on her way to the grocery store. She had just relocated to Texas to take a job opportunity with her alma mater, which is Prairie View A&M. And just in the course of, quite frankly, living while Black in America, which we all know far too well, she was pulled over by a police officer for failure to use her turn signal to change lanes. And unfortunately, she was brutalized in the field and was taken to jail, where she was found dead 3 days later.
Shantae, you were actually one of the last one to speak to Sandy in jail.
Yes.
We have a clip of that, actually. Let's play it.
I said, what are you in jail for? She said, you know, I really don't know. And she said, my arm is hurting really bad. And I could hear her talking to the guards in the background. Then she said, I'll call you back. And she hung up the phone, and she never called back. I wouldn't wish this hurt on anyone. Anyone.
The emotions are still so raw, and you watch this and still so many unanswered questions. I want to point out that your family never even got a call that she passed away. It was a cousin that called and told you. What do you think happened? Do you think she took her own life?
To be honest with you, we'll never know. Everything surrounding it was questionable. So we'll never know. And that's what hurts the most.
Is the officer still, where's the officer?
Yeah.
He's no longer working for Texas. We don't know what he's doing right now, but he was fired 6 months after she passed.
And there was no camera.
So he was on the payroll for 6 months.
For 6 months.
And there was a perjury charge against him.
Correct.
As I recall. What happened to that? And what happened with the perjury charge is that it was dropped. And what you will see in a lot of these cases, folks don't understand why people in the Black community don't get excited about an indictment, because an indictment doesn't necessarily equate to a conviction.
Right.
And so in this instance, when the indictment came down, it was a perjury charge, which was the minimal amount. I believe he could have served a year in jail. That charge was dropped with the promise that he wouldn't practice law enforcement in the state of Texas, when quite frankly, he shouldn't be a law enforcement official anywhere.
So only law enforcement in Texas?
Correct. That is correct.
And my understanding is, Sharon, your family reached a $1.9 million settlement in your wrongful death lawsuit with the promise of jail reform and police de-escalation training. Because it's very clear from this case that I covered when I was at CNN that he did not de-escalate the situation, he almost escalated the situation, in my opinion. What was that promise fulfilled, the training promise?
I think it was fulfilled to a certain degree. We were in a position where we were able to get an act passed that, in addition to some of the issues that we had with the jail, it was that there was monitoring that they said was done that wasn't done, and there was falsification of jail logs. So some of those things were addressed in the Sandra Bland Act. Unfortunately, the police de-escalation, which is the crucial point of legislation, was left on the cutting room floor. And so while it's disheartening, it's not a reason for us not to continue to fight, which is what we do, because ultimately that is what we need in this country. Is we need our law enforcement officials to be trained appropriately so that they can handle all situations that they encounter.
Especially in de-escalation.
Absolutely.
Especially when you know that there are kids with special needs who are out there, young Black men who, you know, who are not responding to anything but someone yelling at them, and maybe, you know, so there's a lot that needs to happen between law enforcement and the citizens. Do you feel people are listening?
Absolutely.
Good.
I think people are listening. I just hope they listen and activate what's already in them. Contact your elected officials, hold them accountable, and don't just sit at home and say, oh, that's sad. No, do something. Call, write, go sit in the office, do something.
Sharon, 3 years later, how's the family doing? Is there any closure? And if not, what needs to happen for there to be some closure here?
I think for us in particular, I think closure will always be in far reach, largely due to the fact that we don't have the answers that we need. And I think at this point, the answers would come from the person who's no longer here to give them to us, unfortunately, which is my sister. What I will say is this: I think what needs to be done, in addition to what Shantae already expressed, is that those who have the power, who are in boardrooms, who have a platform, who have a voice, who can actually reach people, those are the folks who not only need to be an ally for change, because we talk a lot about allyship, but need to be an accomplice for change. You have to be willing to stir some things up, quite frankly. You have to be willing to amplify your voice.
Do exactly
and speak
what your
louder.
sister did.
Exactly.
The funniest thing I remember about Sandy is she called me and she said, "Sister, let's go get our nails done." I said, "Oh, on you?" She said, "Absolutely." I said, "Well, let's go then. Where we meeting at? Come on." And I just love the way she says, "Sister." Like I'll kill to hear that just one more time.
No, I feel justice was definitely not served to the family on so many levels. They lost a daughter through the malfeasance of law enforcement. There's no bringing her back. There are a lot of things that really cause you to lose sleep in this case. The injustices all have this creepy, racist vibe to them. The Deep South, you know, hanging in a Texas jail cell. I mean, are you kidding me? In the 21st century?
Whatever led to her death was part of a systemic failure. You know, she was brought down either way, clearly. We see it beginning with the dash cam. And why is that kind of thing allowed to happen in this day and age in this country? And it does on a daily basis.
There's no way to look at this without seeing a system that had ganged up on her and taken her down. And whether one rogue cop went in there and strangled her, or whether they demoralized this person from the get-go, beating them up on the roadside, false charges, solitary confinement, she was brought down. And so I believe she was lynched.
Demonstrators march from the Texas jail to the courthouse.
Like everybody else in the world, I think we were just transfixed by the story. Was this a murder? Was it not? There were allegations flying back and forth.
Sandra Bland was not an isolated case. She was symptomatic of a culture that has permeated for years in Waller County.
Sheriff Glenn Smith had previously been suspended for documented cases of racism.
Let's get this clear. Sheriff Glenn Smith is racist. He was fired from another police entity for being racist. And then they hired him over at Waller County. The level of racism in Texas is outrageous. When you step into Waller County, you can feel it. How the people look at you, they don't speak, they just staring. How they talk to you. It took a lot of strength and courage to be sitting in that courtroom, listening to, oh my God, sometimes they would just laugh like things were funny. I know, I feel deep down in my soul that they did something to my sister.
It's all of these things that make you feel like you're living in the 1940s and 50s. For me, some things that left me with a lot of questions. Very early on, we talked to a couple of different people who were working at the jail, whether it was jailers or staff or what have you, and everybody had a little bit of a different story. At one point, they said that there was a woman in the jail who heard Sandy crying and who realized she was distraught. This woman, she did one media interview, which I don't really recall all the contents of it. I've never been able to find that woman. In terms of how Sandy was found, whether she was found suspended, hanging from the partition, then it turned to, well, she was slumped down when we found her in the partition. Like that, to me, that attention to detail is crucial. But when you're trying to figure out what it is that happened to your loved one, you want to make sure that the story that you're told is consistent.
They was just so tacky. My sister was taken to the white funeral home before being taken to the medical examiner. Then she was taken to the black funeral home. For me, that means that you took her there to make your story match. I think they killed her. Honestly, they do things there. I just didn't know, and I absolutely would have never thought she would be dead.
There was this misconception and notion that Sandy was calling home all weekend, and that wasn't the case. We actually spoke to her one time. The defense, at some point in the case, took the position that Sandy killed herself because her family wouldn't bail her out of jail. That was so insulting.
When she called me, had I known that getting her out was gonna be the death of her, I would have done everything in my power to get her out that Saturday.
Sandy died because she failed to use her turn signal while she was driving, something that people do every single day. Everything that we do in the skin that we live in is criminalized.
The pulling Sandy out of the car would never have happened to a white woman, in my humble opinion. I think it was a gender and race insult to the power dynamics that a white police officer has come to expect in America. And those are dynamics that should not come into play.
I want to see true justice happen here. That's what I want to see. Let's talk about the real charges that should be going on here. I want the process to really be handled the right way. That is what I, as the mom, want.
Quite frankly, a starting point with regard to justice starts with acknowledgement of wrongdoing, an apology, and serving time.
But justice for me is the jail being closed down. Everybody who was on duty that day, they all fired because they all failed my sister. And this button was made. He makes these buttons each time the police kill someone. And it's a shame because he has made so many buttons where the police have killed our loved ones and gotten away with it.
There's so many ways that Black women are brutalized, and to not know their names, I was embarrassed by it. And so now I seek out the information and try to lift up the names of those who are impacted. It's a way to affirm from one sister to another that I see you and I understand that based off of your experience, it could be me.
We need to remember that she was a full-blown, three-dimensional person.
Good morning, my beautiful kings and queens. It is Friday, April 10th, 2015. My job has become saving these youth.
Sandy could have very well been your mother, your sister, your friend.
To say her name is keeping Sandra Bland and her story alive and in people's minds so that we can continue to learn from it and so that she can speak for the thousands of people we'll never know.
What do we want? Justice! When do we want it? Now!
The whole thing is that she was very arrogant from the beginning, very dismissive of the officer. All right, she was very
She said,
uncooperative.
I'm in my car, why do I have to put out my cigarette?
Well, I'm not debating the cigarette issue.
Maybe he's allergic, who knows?
You know, there's a possibility, yes.
Go ahead.
Well, and I think that's the issue here. You know, who is the trained professional? When you get a badge and a gun, that gives you power. And with that power comes the responsibility, I think, to de-escalate a situation like that. And what we saw was an officer trying to exert power on her by asking her to put her cigarette out. Guess what, Don? I checked the penal code. There is no law against smoking a cigarette in your car. You can't arrest someone for doing that. So when he asked her to get out of the car, that was improper. That was inappropriate, and he failed to disclose it.
She was being arrested
is
for
the
her.
professional. He is the
She was
professional.
being arrested
and he
because
lost
a summons
his
is
cool.
in lieu of arrest. All right, and the fact that he can't ask her
He
to get out
wasn't
of the
giving
car.
her a summons, though.
All
He was
right?
giving her a warning.
We don't know that to the end.
But he knew that.
We don't know that to the end.
But he knew that.
We don't know that to the end. I'm sure he wrote her a summons.
Yeah.
After the arrest, she wrote her a
warning.
summons.
Go ahead, Mark.
I found this video to be disturbing, disgusting, unsettling. I mean, really on multiple levels. This woman simply was in her car and had the audacity to not be entirely deferential to the officer. She doesn't have to kiss the officers, but she has a right to be irritated. A lot of us get irritated when we get pulled over. This officer comes to her and says, is there something wrong? You seem like you have an attitude. He's trying to pick a fight with her. He essentially says, why are you upset? And when she says, look, this is why I'm ticked off. However, you still have a job to do. You're still going to give me the ticket. So just give me the ticket. You have a right to say that. Sometimes police officers act as if you're not completely kowtowing and deferential, that somehow you're violating a law. He asked her to put out a cigarette. She very accurately pointed out that she didn't have to put out a cigarette. She's in her car. And at that point, he threatens to drag her out to, quote unquote, light her up. This type of violence is a reminder that state violence, number one, is exacted not just on men but on women, but particularly black women who have always been vulnerable in these spaces. But this is a perfect example of exactly how vulnerable black women are in public space to law enforcement. This did not have to happen. As Sonny said, this was entirely preventable.
Mark, even if
I have a right to have
even if he de-escalated the whole situation, she would have still kept on coming at that officer the way she did. She did not want to cooperate with that officer.
I have a right to, Harry.
Oh, I'm sorry. You've got to cooperate with the police officer, Mark. You have to.
She wasn't being
cooperate.
uncooperative.
Yes, she was. She was being uncooperative.
She wasn't being
goes, I don't have to show you my ID. Didn't you hear her? I don't have to show you my ID. I don't have to tell you who I am.
That's not what she said.
That's what she was saying. It's right in the video. She did.
No, listen, Harry, hold on, Harry. Harry, she said, I only have to show you my ID. Yeah.
She said, I don't have to tell you my name. I don't have to show you my ID. That's exactly what she said inside the car.
She said, I'm a little bit irritated, but it doesn't stop you from giving me a ticket. So, and then he says, are you done? He said, you asked me what was wrong. And then she goes on and talks a cigarette. I don't see anything about an ID unless that happened earlier. Oh, I refuse to talk to other than I said, oh, here he goes. She says, do I have the right now to step out or I remove you? And she says, I refuse to talk to you other than to identify myself.
And that is actually correct.
That's the opposite of what Harry just said.
Okay, all right, Mark.
So Harry, that's the opposite of
what
what you just said.
All right,
but
I thought
again,
that's what you said. To talk. Okay,
one thing
I'll give you that.
One thing I think
First of all, in that case, she said she was pulling, or the evidence, and we heard her say she was pulling over to allow the police to go by her.
Right. She didn't think it was for her.
Yeah. And secondly, she's allowed to smoke a cigarette. Yeah. And he very commanding required her to put her cigarette out.
Right.
Then required her to get out of the car. Well, that is the law if the police request that you get out of the car. However, it is public policy and the color of the law, if you will, that it's only done when you have a reasonable threat.
Right, that's
to your
what I
safety.
thought. Exactly, because he wasn't threatened because he walked away from the car to go write the ticket and came back with the ticket.
And the threat, he certainly didn't feel threatened enough to pull out a taser and curse her and threaten to
light her up.
And then snatch her, and from what I understand, and I think what we may have heard, is he slammed her on the ground.
Yeah.
Pushed her head on the ground, and she began to tell him how she had epilepsy.
Right.
As did Eric Garner when he was telling the police that he couldn't breathe.
Right.
Similar situation. So whatever may have happened in that cell, nothing would have occurred like that. She would still be alive were it not for, in my opinion, the illegal search and seizure and what I believe perhaps was an assault by a police officer.
First.
In the law we say but for almost equals causation. In other words, did he cause the crime? Well, whether he caused her death or not, but for his actions, she would still be alive. So that's my opinion.
Good morning, my kings and my queens. I come to you, first of all, saying thank you. Thank God for you. Thank God for this morning. And thank God for this day. Making your way through a storm. Whoever may be in a storm right now, whatever you have going on, just know God has got your back. He is in ultimate control. There is nothing that he can't do and won't do as long as you have your mind and your heart in the right place. So my kings and my queens, I say to you today, go out there and establish that kingdom, establish that queendom.